Welcome back to Chapter 3. This is the second part. Oh, there it is again. Chapter 3, Part 2. Part 2. All right, the focus of this part of the chapter is individual differences. We're going to start by talking about personality. And a key point that I want to make to you is that, in fact, each of us has multiple personalities. I'm going to explain that a bit more. Just keep that in the back of your mind. That, in fact, trying to describe your personality can be challenging, in part because you don't have just one. Personality, the word comes to us from the root personare, which means to speak or to sound through. To understand what this is trying to get at, I would ask you to consider the word persona, which essentially means mask. If you imagine each of us having multiple masks, a mask that we put on depending on, for example, the situation or what is being asked of us. As we wear that mask, we speak through it. And what comes through it is a particular version of our personality. The basic definition of personality given to you here is that relatively stable, relatively stable. What that means is that over time, your personality absolutely can, and for most people, does change. Relatively stable set of feelings, thoughts, and behavioral patterns that differentiate us from other folks. So what determines our personality? Well, three different factors. First, our heredity. Just like your eyes are a certain color because of your genetics, you're a particular height in part because of your genetics, well, so too with your personality. Great example. My second son, Michael. Wonderful, wonderful young man. When he was born, he was a very quiet baby, very calm, very laid back. I mean, from the very beginning, he was this way. He still is. My other two sons, the oldest and the youngest, less so, less calm, less relaxed. Again, right from birth, and that some aspect of that has continued with them throughout their lives. So there is a genetic or heredity component to our personality. A second component is how we're raised. And when I say this, I don't mean just by your primary caregivers, although obviously they play a critical role in how we're raised, but really I'm talking about every single person who's had some kind of impact in who we are at any given point. All those teachers, all the friends you've had, your extended family, people you've worked with, you name it, coaches, all of those people have had an impact on your personality. And then finally, the situation in which we find ourselves. For example, think about how you behave around your friends, what you're like around your very best friends, the people you most love to hang out with. Contrast that with what you're like around your family. Contrast that with how you might be when you're at work. For most of us, there will be at least subtle differences in our personality depending on the situation. How I behave in a classroom might be quite different than how I behave hanging out with just my family. Are you with me? Think about yourself, maybe use the student. For many of you, in a classroom, you might be pretty darn quiet, right? And if a person only ever saw you in that environment, they might be like, wow, shy even. And then for many of you, while you might be pretty quiet in a classroom, get you outside the classroom, get you hanging with your friends, you're boisterous, you got lots of energy, you're very talkative. What's going on? Well, different situation. So a different personality emerges. A key point on this slide, it says when situational pressures are weak, we are better able to be ourselves and let our personalities guide our behaviors. And what that means is when we don't perceive a lot of pressure to conform to a norm, we are more likely to behave like our authentic selves. When we perceive strong social norms that dictate our behavior, for example, in a classroom, most of us feel as though there's this norm where we don't want to look stupid, we don't want to be like that one student who always talks, et cetera, et cetera. There's some pretty strong social norms going on in classrooms. In that situation, many people are likely to just sort of chill and not necessarily let their real or authentic personality emerge. It can be the same in the workplace, where again, it's not our most authentic selves that appear because we perhaps perceive really strong situational or social pressures. Lots of different ways to talk about your personality. I'm going to run through some. Keep in mind that even with all of the ones that I'm going to talk about, there are more ways to describe your personality because, frankly, human beings are complex. We're multifaceted. There's no one thing that's going to tell you who you are with respect to your personality. There's no one measure, there's no one instrument. No matter how many tests you take, there's always another test that could reveal something else. So just keep that in mind. One popular framework for thinking about personality, especially as it relates to the workplace, is the Big Five. Here they are. If you had to memorize these things for a class, which you don't for this class, there's no need to memorize anything, you would notice that together the words, the first letter gives you the word ocean. Okay. So one way of describing ourselves is with respect to our openness. Now I want you to imagine a line, a continuum, if you will, for each of these. It is not the case that you're just one of the things that you're seeing on the screen here, but rather that you're somewhere on a continuum for each of these 5 things. So with respect to openness, for example, you are more open or less open, somewhere along that line. Openness is all about being curious, original, intellectual, creative, open to new ideas, all the things you would expect it to be, right? Conscientiousness. Oh, that's a big word. Maybe say that one out loud for yourself. Conscientiousness. It's not consciousness. That's an entirely different concept. Conscientiousness is all about being organized. It's all about getting stuff done. It's about being reliable. And each of us, again, is on a continuum from high to low. Extroversion is all about how we get our energy. It's about being outgoing, talkative, sociable. Here, the spectrum runs from extrovert to introvert. We'll talk more about that when we talk about the Myers-Briggs. Agreeableness, just what you'd think it is, being affable, which is friendly, right? Tolerant of others, sensitive, trusting, kind, and warm. How well we get along with people, basically. Again, you're somewhere on the continuum or the spectrum from high to low. And then finally, neuroticism. Sometimes you'll see this referred to as emotional stability. The original characterization, though, the word that's used is neuroticism. And this is all about being anxious, irritable, temperamental, moody. And we are all somewhere, again, on the continuum, the spectrum, from less to more neurotic. Somewhere on that spectrum. Right now, I'll bet a lot of us are feeling more neurotic perhaps than we might typically feel because, frankly, these are unusual times, aren't they? They're not within our normal context. There's so much uncertainty. So many of us might be feeling more anxious, more moody, etc., than we otherwise would. Another way of characterizing our personality is using the Myers-Briggs. I'll bet a lot of you have done this, or some version of it. In fact, there's one in particular that I'm going to recommend to you, one assessment that you can take that will give you insight into your personality using this Myers-Briggs framework. Essentially, there are 4 continua, or spectra, dimensions like extroversion versus introversion, sensing versus intuition, thinking versus feeling, judgment versus perception. You are more one than the other. So for example, you're more extroverted or more introverted. You're more of a sensor or more of an intuitor. You're more of a thinker or more of a feeler, more of a judger, more of a perceiver. So you end up with some 4 letters that essentially describe your personality. Extroversion is all about gathering energy from other people, things outside of us, things external to us. Introverts, on the other hand, gather their energy from inside, from being reflective. You're more one or the other. Sensing versus intuitive is all about how we gather information. So sensors tend to use their 5 senses. Intuitives tend to rely on their intuition and their hunches. Thinking versus feeling is all about how we make decisions. Both are rational. Thinkers tend to use logic. Feelers tend to use their values. One way I like to characterize these two is that thinkers tend to consider decisions in terms of justice, what will be fair for everyone, while feelers tend to think about mercy, what particular circumstances might individuals be experiencing that we should consider as we make decisions that could affect them. And then finally, judging versus perceiving. This is all about lifestyle preference. People who prefer to live their life using judgment, like things organized and systematic. These folks all have planners. They know exactly what they're going to do and when. Whereas perceivers tend to be very open-minded. They like some higher degree of ambiguity. Another word that I think fits well would be spontaneous. They like things to be spontaneous. Now, I want to direct your attention to this very cool site. You see the link here, www.16personalities.com. There you can take a free assessment, won't cost you anything. And when you're done, the assessment will put out just where you are with respect to each of these 4 different sets of dimensions, whether you're more extroverted or introverted, more of a sensor or an intuitive, more of a thinker or a feeler, more of a judger or perceiver. In my particular case, my 4 letters are I. I'm definitely an introvert, meaning I gather my energy being alone or with small groups of people. I'm an N, so I'm an intuitive. I tend to think in terms of patterns. I'm an F, which means when I make decisions, I tend to think about values and principles. Mercy matters to me. It doesn't mean that I'm not logical. It means that given a choice between using my logic or my values, I may, at least in some cases, be more likely to use my values to help me make a decision. And then finally, J versus P, I'm a perceiver. I like things spontaneous. I like to not have my weekends all scheduled, for example. None of these is better than others. They are just what they are. You will have your 4 letters. You may be very strongly toward one end of a continuum or the other, or you may be somewhere near the middle. The word we would use to describe someone who's sort of in the middle between the 2 opposite ends of the spectrum would be an ambivert, okay? Extrovert versus introvert. If you're somewhere in the middle, meaning sometimes you're an extrovert, sometimes you're an introvert, we would call you an ambivert, okay? Meaning amba, meaning both. Anyway, check it out. It's worth your time. I think you'll find it very interesting. Another way that we can think about personality has to do with positive and negative affectivity. So that's not effectivity, that's affectivity. The word affect means emotion. Okay, it's a great word to have in your toolkit or your own personal dictionary, if you will. Affect means emotion. So how we behave is also a function of our moods. When we're in a good mood, we tend to be more cooperative, we smile more, we're more friendly. When we're in a not so good mood, we can be super picky and irritable and less tolerant. Honestly, right now, I'll bet a lot of people are experiencing more bad moods than perhaps they might typically experience. Again, weird times, right? And what's interesting about moods is that we often can't pinpoint why we're in a good mood or a not so good mood. In other words, there isn't a particular trigger for that mood. It could be that we even say something like, I just woke up feeling this way. There isn't, again, something specific. Whereas with an emotion, there's typically a very specific trigger. I'm angry because, I'm happy because. But moods tend to be nonspecific. People who are generally more positive, who have more good moods, tend to experience those good moods more frequently. This is a little bit of the self-fulfilling prophecy thing happening. And people who are negative in terms of their affect tend to experience negative moods with greater frequency. We might think of some of these folks as Debbie Downer or Eeyore from Winnie the Pooh, where these folks, people who are negatively affective, they just sort of tend to see bad things coming no matter what. Another way of characterizing our personality has to do with what's called self-monitoring. This is the extent to which we're capable of altering our actions and appearance in social situations. In other words, do we flex, do we change according to what we think is expected of us? Are you tracking with me? Another phrase that gets at this is this notion of impression management, where we try to manage other people's impressions of us. Now, that's a very specific activity, whereas self-monitoring is a descriptor for our personalities. Some of us are better than others at adapting our behavior to fit situations. Those of us who are better at it, we would be considered high self-monitors. So we pick up very quickly on what a situation demands, and we act accordingly. We alter our behavior accordingly. Look at some of the things associated with being a high self-monitor. These folks tend to be more successful. No surprise, right? Because they adapt, they change themselves to suit what other people are looking for. They may be less accurate when evaluating someone else's performance, perhaps because they themselves are imagining that that person might be behaving a particular way just to suit other people's needs. They could experience higher levels of stress. All this adaptation, instead of just sort of being yourself, can of course be stressful. And they may be less committed to their companies, so they may be more likely to turn over, to go back to that dependent variable. Low self-monitors, on the other hand, tend to just act the way they feel. They never behave differently than however they might be feeling. They don't adapt to a given situation. They won't try to be pleasant if that's what the situation calls for and they're just not feeling it. With a low self-monitor, you get what you get. Another way of describing our personality has to do with what's called proactive personality. This is all about taking initiative. Are you the kind of person who, when you come into a situation and you see, hey, you know what? This could be done better, faster, cheaper, easier. Are you the kind of person who takes the initiative to make that happen? Well, people with proactive personalities are. These folks have this inclination to fix whatever they might perceive to be wrong. They're the folks who are happy to change the status quo, to mix things up. They will step forward to use their initiative to solve problems. Some advantages. These folks tend to be more successful. They're the go-getters, not only in job searches, but also over the course of their career. They tend to adjust pretty quickly because they pick up on all the different cues. They tend to make friends more quickly, and they tend to be more responsive to feedback. They want to adjust. They want to make things better, faster, cheaper, easier, and so on. And they really see themselves as capable of doing that. Are you more or less proactive? Self-esteem is another thing that we might talk about relative to your personality. As it says here, this is simply the degree to which people have overall positive feelings about themselves. In other words, the extent to which you like yourself, okay? People with high self-esteem tend to see themselves in a positive light, tend to be confident, tend to respect themselves. People with low self-esteem, on the other hand, tend to experience lots of self-doubt and to question their self-worth. Now, is one better than the other? Is it better to have high self-esteem or low self-esteem? Well, an argument could be made either way, right? On the one hand, it's great to feel good about yourself and to be confident as you go through life, tackling whatever issues might get in your way or that you might need to confront. On the other hand, it's also good to not be overly confident, to maybe have a little bit of self-doubt. That might be the thing that we need to help us press on, to continue to try and be better. After all, if you think that you're perfect, where's the motivation to continue to strive to be better, right? So a bit of a mixed bag. Self-esteem is quite different than self-efficacy. One, self-esteem is that sort of overall, how do you feel about yourself? Self-efficacy is focused on specific tasks. Self-esteem by itself doesn't really dictate whether we'll perform well, but self-efficacy absolutely does. This is essentially the belief that we can perform a specific task successfully. Another way of defining this is to call self-efficacy our task-specific self-confidence. Okay, you see that in the third bullet. It's task-specific. And I got to tell you, as it says in the second bullet, the belief that we can do something is in fact a really good predictor of whether we can actually do it. Let me use an example. I have myself what I consider to be pretty high public speaking self-efficacy. Notice how I have identified one specific task, public speaking, and I'm going to talk about my self-efficacy or my confidence around just that one task, public speaking. So I have pretty high public speaking self-efficacy. I feel confident when I have to give a speech or a presentation in front of virtually any size group of people. What would you expect to happen as a result of the fact that I have pretty high public speaking self-efficacy in terms of performance? Well, when it comes to actually doing public speaking, more often than not, I do a pretty good job. Now, it doesn't mean I'm perfect. I would never go there. There's always room to improve, right? We can always do better. And yet, generally speaking, the results, the outcomes, are usually pretty decent. I can do a pretty good job. And a lot of that has to do, of course, with the fact that I have a lot of experience doing public speaking. I've been doing it since I was 7, okay? And it also has to do with the fact that I feel pretty confident. So I'm not nervous in the same way that someone whose public speaking self-efficacy might be low. I'm less likely to stumble over my words, although, of course, we all do from time to time. Contrast that with something where I don't have very high self-efficacy, something like golfing. My golf self-efficacy is incredibly low. I don't feel at all confident that I can do it well. What would you predict in terms of my performance out on a golf course? Probably pretty low, right? Well, if that's what you predicted, you'd be spot on. Because I don't feel confident, I worry, I second guess myself, all the things that go with when you don't feel confident. Number one, I avoid golfing as much as possible, which means I'm not getting experience. And without practice, you can't get good at something, right? That's one of the key things you have to do. If you want to get good at something, you got to do it. Because my golf self-efficacy is so low, I don't do it. And if I have to do it, all that's going through my mind the whole time is, oh, you suck at this, you're not good at this, you're not going to do well. And sure enough, guess what? I don't. So again, a self-fulfilling prophecy. People with high self-efficacy tend to set higher goals for themselves. They tend to be more committed to those goals. They feel confident that they can achieve those goals. Whereas people with low self-efficacy around a given task tend to put it off. Now, notice, you're putting something off or you're procrastinating on something does not in and of itself mean that you have low self-efficacy around that thing. There can be all kinds of things that contribute to us procrastinating. That's not the relationship we're talking about here. We're talking about if you do have low self-efficacy around a given task, what are the odds that you're going to procrastinate? Well, the odds are actually really good. Locus of control, another way that we describe our personality. This has to do with the degree to which we feel accountable for our own behaviors. Another way to put that is the degree to which we think we control what happens to us. Okay? So people with a high internal locus of control basically believe that they control their own destiny. Now, that doesn't mean that they don't acknowledge other people or other factors and how those might influence their performance, for example. Rather, they really feel as though if things aren't going their way, they can take action to make a difference. These folks feel greater control over their own lives, more involved in their own jobs. They tend to be more motivated, and they're pretty good at coming up with coping strategies. And it all is based in the fact that they believe that if they, for example, exert more effort, good things will happen. That if they work on increasing their ability, they will be able to do a better job. So this high internal locus of control has a direct and positive correlation with performance. Folks with a high external locus of control believe that stuff just happens to them, that they're not really in charge of their own destiny. Now let me give you an example with both of these to illustrate further. Imagine that two students have taken an exam and they've gotten the results and they didn't do that great. Whoops. Take the case of the person with the high internal locus of control. What do you think that person might say when they receive that exam back and they see that they didn't do well? Take a moment and think about this. If you guessed something along the lines of the person with a high internal locus of control would probably think to themselves, I needed to study more, or I need to take better notes, or I needed to go see the professor, you'd be right. Basically, a person with a high internal locus of control, when they're faced with something that didn't go well, they're going to look to themselves first for the explanation. They're going to work on their own effort, their own ability, the things that they personally can control. That's what they're going to say made the difference. Consider the other student, the one with the high external locus of control. They do poorly. What are they thinking? If you guessed something like, oh, they probably think the teacher didn't do a very good job of teaching, or the test was too hard, or the questions were tricky, again, you'd be right. A person with an external locus of control looks outside of themselves to assign responsibility for what happens to them. So they're not going to be thinking, gosh, if I had tried harder. No, 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 no. When they do poorly on something, they're going to be looking to blame somebody else or something else, anything but themselves, because, again, they don't consider themselves in charge of what happens to them. And that brings us to the end of part 2 for chapter 3. Thanks for listening, and get ready for the final installment, part 3.